The wheat was ready. Every farmer in Reno County, Kansas, knew it. You could feel it in the air, that dry, papery stillness that only comes in late June when the plains hold their breath and the grain stands straight and golden and waiting. You could smell the harvest coming 3 days before it arrived, a sweetness almost like toast, like the earth itself had been baking. It was the morning of June 22, 1971, and on the east edge of a field just outside Nickerson, Kansas, 640 acres of hard red winter wheat standing 6 feet tall in places, a machine sat silent. Not resting, silent the way a broken thing is silent. The Gleaner K combined serial number K14402, built in 1968 out of the Allis-Chalmers plant in Independence, Missouri, sat at the edge of that field with its header down and its engine cold, surrounded by 4 men in neckties who had driven out from Hutchinson in 2 separate cars, and who had between them a combined 41 years of mechanical engineering experience. And not one of them could start it. They'd been there since 6 in the morning. It was now 9:30. The wheat wouldn't wait for neckties, and it wouldn't wait for pride. Let me take you to Reno County, Kansas, in the summer of 1971, because you need to feel this place before you can understand this story. Reno County sits in the south-central part of Kansas, out where the land flattens into something almost biblical in its scale. The Nickerson River runs through the bottom of it, slow and muddy and indifferent. The towns out there, Nickerson, Haven, Plevna, Turon, are the kind of towns where the grain elevator is the tallest building, where the co-op parking lot fills up before the church parking lot on a Saturday morning, where a man's reputation is measured not by what he says but by what his fields look like come late June. In 1971, Kansas was in the middle of something. The farm economy was beginning to loosen, beginning to breathe after the lean years of the mid-60s. Wheat was trading around $1.60 a bushel, not great, but not desperate either. The bigger operations were starting to buy bigger machines. International dealers and John Deere dealers were running ads in the Hutchinson News every single week, promising the future: air-conditioned cabs, wider headers, faster cylinder speeds. And Allis-Chalmers, the orange machines, the ones that some farmers swore by and others swore at, had just put out their new K-series combine a few years prior. The Gleaner K was a handsome machine. Tall, orange-painted, with a name stenciled on the side in bold block letters that made it look like it meant business. The engineers at Allis-Chalmers had updated the cleaning system, redesigned the cylinder, and added new feeder house geometry that was supposed to handle thick, tangled wheat stands better than anything on the market. Supposed to. On the right day, with the right man behind the controls, the Gleaner K could cut and thresh 100 acres of hard red winter wheat before supper. On June 22, 1971, it couldn't do anything at all. Let me tell you about Cleddy's Harmon. If you'd driven past Cleddy's Harmon on the street in Nickerson, Kansas in 1971, you would not have looked twice. He was 63 years old that summer, a lean, weathered man with hands that looked like they'd been carved from old fence posts, brown and knotted and permanently stained with grease along the knuckles where no amount of lava soap ever quite reached. He stood 5'9" on a good day, wore the same style of green Dickies work pants he'd been wearing since 1952, and kept a flat-brimmed seed corn cap on his head from April through October without fail. He didn't talk much. That was the first thing people noticed, or rather, the first thing people noticed about Cleddy's Harmon was the silence that followed him around. Not an unfriendly silence, just a quiet that felt earned. The quiet of a man who had learned that most problems, if you watched them long enough, would tell you exactly what was wrong with them. Cleddy's had grown up on his family's quarter section, 160 acres, just north of Nickerson on a piece of ground his father had broken in 1923. He'd taken over the farm in 1948 when his father's back gave out, married a woman named Ruth Elaine Prater from over near Pretty Prairie, and spent the better part of 30 years farming that same ground with the same stubbornness and the same quiet competence that the county had come to expect from a Harmon. He wasn't a wealthy man. He'd never bought new when used would do. His own combine, a 1961 Gleaner E that he'd bought second-hand from a retiring farmer in McPherson County for $2,200 in 1963, sat in his machine shed and had never once left him stranded in a field. He knew that machine the way some men know scripture. He knew it sounds when it was happy and it sounds when it wasn't. He knew what the cylinder speed gauge was supposed to say in thick wheat versus thin wheat. He knew how the cleaning shoe behaved when the chaffer was set a hair too tight. He knew Gleaner machines is the simple truth of it. Had known them since 1955, when he'd first run a Gleaner A on a neighbor's place and spent 3 hours one August afternoon lying on his back in the stubble figuring out why the shoe was losing grain, before anyone else had even thought to look. Nobody had asked Cledys Harmon to come to that field on June 22, 1971. He came because he was driving past on County Road 48, saw the 2 cars and the 4 men standing around a dead machine, and did what any farmer worth his salt does when he sees another man's equipment sitting wrong at harvest time. He stopped. Now let me tell you about the men standing around that Gleaner K, because you need to understand what Cledys Harmon walked into that morning. The field belonged to Dale and Wright. Dale was 41 years old, a second-generation farmer who'd inherited 1,100 acres from his father and had spent the intervening years adding to it whenever a neighbor fell on hard times, which, in the 1960s, happened with some regularity. Dale and Wright was not an evil man. But he was the particular kind of prosperous man who had confused good fortune with good judgment, and who had built around himself a circle of people who never told him he was wrong. He'd bought the Gleaner K new in the spring of 1970, paid $14,800 for it, which was a serious sum, because a dealer over in Hutchinson named Warren Pollock had told him it was the finest combine on the plains and that it would outperform anything Deere or International had on the market. Dale had never run an Allis-Chalmers machine before. Didn't matter. New was new. Warren Pollock was the second man at that field that morning, and he is important to this story. Warren Pollock was the kind of man who sells things for a living, and has decided somewhere along the way that selling things is the same as knowing things. He was 46, wore a bolo tie even on farm calls, drove a 1970 Buick Electra 225 that he kept clean enough to eat off of, and had a handshake that was just slightly too firm in the way that handshakes are when a man is reminding you he's in charge. He had sold farm equipment for 19 years. He had repaired very little of it personally. The other 2 men were from the Allis-Chalmers regional office in Wichita, sent out the day before when Dale and Wright called in a panic. Their names were Gary Tischler and Bob Menn. Gary had a degree in mechanical engineering from Kansas State. Bob had been with Allis-Chalmers for 6 years and considered himself an authority on the K-series. They'd arrived the previous afternoon, worked on the machine until dark, gone back to a motel in Hutchinson, and returned that morning no closer to an answer. The machine was turning over, the battery was fine, fuel was flowing, the engine would crank, you could hear it, but it would not catch, would not fire, just that long, grinding, hopeful crank that turned into silence. Gary Tischler had already decided, by the time Cledys Harmon pulled his truck to the shoulder of County Road 48, that the problem was internal. Possibly a timing issue. Possibly injector failure. He was ready to tell Dale and Wright the combine needed to go back to the shop in Hutchinson, which would mean loading it on a flatbed and losing at least 4 days of harvest. 4 days in late June Kansas wheat. That wasn't a delay, that was a disaster. Cledys Harmon parked his truck, climbed out slowly, pushed his cap back on his head, and walked toward the machine. Warren Pollock watched him come and didn't bother to say hello. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room or a field where you knew something that nobody else knew and had to decide whether to say it? That particular moment where you can either keep your head down and drive on or stop and offer what you have. Cledys Harmon had driven past, then he'd stopped. That decision tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He walked up to the Gleaner K, didn't say a word to anyone, just stood for a moment looking at it with his hands in his pockets. Then he looked over at Dale and Wright, who he knew slightly. They'd been at the same co-op meetings a few times over the years. She won't start. Dale shook his head. Since yesterday afternoon. These fellas have been working on it since 6 this morning. Cledys nodded. He walked around the front of the machine, looked at the header, looked at the feeder house, and looked up at the cab. Then he started toward the engine compartment on the right side. Warren Pollock stepped forward. We've got it covered, friend. He said it the way you say it when you mean the opposite. These gentlemen are from the Allis-Chalmers engineering office out of Wichita. They're handling it. Cledys looked at Warren Pollock for a moment. You need me to leave? Warren Pollock glanced at Dale and Wright. Dale shrugged. He's fine, Warren, let him look. Cleddy's moved to the engine compartment and opened it. He stood there, looking, not reaching yet, just looking. The two engineers watched him with the particular expression that educated men get when an uneducated man approaches a technical problem, patient, slightly amused, already composing in their heads how they'll describe this later. Gary Tischler couldn't help himself. "We've checked the fuel delivery system thoroughly. We believe it's an internal timing issue. Probably needs to come into the shop." Cleddy's didn't answer right away. He was leaning in now, head tilted, looking at something on the left side of the engine. Then he stood back up. "When'd you last run her?" Dale answered, "Day before yesterday. She ran all afternoon, then quit about 4 o'clock. I thought maybe she was just hot. Let her sit overnight and she wouldn't start in the morning." "Ran all afternoon in that heat," Cleddy said quietly, like he was talking to himself. "It was 94 degrees, Dale said, "but that shouldn't matter. Machine's rated for." "I know what she's rated for," Cleddy said, still quiet, no edge to it, just a fact. Warren Pollock had had enough of this. "Look, friend, and I say this with respect, these men have got 40 years of engineering between them. They've been through this machine top to bottom. If you've got a theory, you're welcome to share it, but we're not going to stand around all morning while." "I'd like to look at the injection pump," Cleddy said. Bobman made a sound, not quite a laugh, something adjacent to it. "We checked the injection pump yesterday afternoon. Pressure is within spec." "I'd still like to look at it." There was a silence, the kind of silence that happens in a field when 4 people are trying to decide how annoyed they are. Dale and Wright made the decision for them. "Let him look, Bob." And here is where Warren Pollock made a mistake that he would remember for the rest of his career. He looked at Gary Tischler and he smiled, just slightly. A smile that said, "Watch this old fool embarrass himself." Gary Tischler smiled back. Cleddy's Harmon didn't see it, or maybe he did and didn't care. He went back to his truck and came back with a canvas tool roll, a flashlight, and a small glass jar, the kind that might have once held Clausen pickles, with about an inch of clean diesel fuel in the bottom. He went back to the engine, and he got to work. "Now I need you to lean in here, because this is the part of the story that matters most." Let me tell you what Cleddy's Harmon knew. Cleddy's had first encountered an Allis-Chalmers Gleaner K prototype at a farm equipment demonstration outside of Pratt, Kansas, in the fall of 1967. He hadn't been in the market for a machine, his old E was still running fine, but he went the way he always went to equipment demonstrations, which was quietly and in the back and with his eyes open. He'd watched the Gleaner K run through a test plot and he'd been impressed, but he'd also noticed something. At the end of the demonstration, when the machine shut down, and the crowd gathered around the shiny new combine with their pamphlets and their questions for the dealer, Cleddy's had walked around to the right side of the engine and stood there for several minutes looking at the routing of the fuel lines and the placement of the injection pump. He'd seen something that bothered him, not in a dramatic way, the way a splinter bothers you, small, persistent, not quite right. The injection pump on the Gleaner K was mounted lower than it had been on the older E-series, closer to the underside of the engine deck, and the fuel return line, the line that carried excess fuel back from the injectors to the tank, ran in a loop that, in Cleddy's estimation, sat in a spot where, under sustained high heat, it could develop a problem. Specifically, a vapor lock. Now, vapor lock is a condition that most modern mechanics know well, but let me explain it plainly for those of you who didn't grow up with a wrench in your hand. Diesel fuel, when it gets hot enough not from the combustion, but from sitting in metal lines near a hot engine in 90-degree ambient heat, can begin to vaporize, to turn partially to vapor inside the fuel lines. And when that happens, you get pockets of air mixed into your fuel delivery system. And a diesel engine cannot compress and fire vapor the way it fires liquid fuel. It just cranks and cranks and cranks. The thing about vapor lock is that it doesn't always show up on a pressure test. If the pocket of vapor is in the right place or the wrong place, depending on how you look at it, your fuel pressure at the pump can test within spec while the actual delivery to the injectors is still compromised. Gary Tischler and Bob Men had checked the injection pump pressure. It was within spec. They had not checked for vapor in the return line under operating conditions. They hadn't thought to, because vapor lock in a diesel system was considered in 1971 to be primarily a gasoline engine problem. the engineering literature on it, as it applied to diesel injection systems, was sparse. Allis-Chalmers had no engineering literature. What he had was 13 years of running a Gleaner E in Kansas summers, a brain that retained mechanical details the way good soil retains moisture, and a Saturday afternoon in 1967 looking at a fuel return line routing that didn't sit right with him. He'd thought about it off and on for 4 years. He opened the fuel return line at the fitting nearest the injection pump. He held his glass jar underneath. He cracked the fitting loose. The first thing that came out wasn't fuel. It was a small, sustained hiss of vapor, visible for just a moment against the morning air, followed by a trickle of diesel that was foamy, bubbly, mixed with air in a way that fuel should never be. Allis-Chalmers looked at it in his jar. He didn't say anything, didn't call anyone over, just looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you expected to find and are not surprised to find, but are still, in a quiet way, grateful that you found it. Then he put his jar down in the stubble and went back to work. Let me ask you something before we go further. How many times in your life have you been absolutely certain you were right, not boastful about it, not loud about it, just privately bone-deep certain, and had to wait for the world to catch up with you? That's a particular kind of patience. The kind Allis-Chalmers had been practicing his whole life. What he did next took 47 minutes. He bled the fuel system, completely. It's a process, methodical, careful, not quick. You work from the tank forward, opening bleed points, allowing the vapor to escape and allowing clean liquid fuel to replace it. On a Gleaner K, with the return line routing the way it was, you had to be careful about the sequence. Open the wrong fitting first and you push the vapor further in rather than out. Allis worked the sequence in an order that none of the 4 men watching him had seen before, from the rear fitting first, then the midline, then forward to the pump. He used a small hand pump, a piece of equipment he fabricated himself from a bilge pump and some copper fittings, a tool he carried in his truck because he'd needed it before, to pull the vapor out in a controlled direction rather than waiting for gravity alone. Warren Pollock watched for about 10 minutes, then he went and sat in his Buick. Gary Tischler and Bob Men stayed. They stayed because, whatever else was true about them, they were engineers, and an engineer cannot walk away from a solution being assembled in front of him, even if he doesn't understand it yet. Dale and Wright leaned against his truck and didn't say a word. The sun climbed, the wheat stood waiting. At 10:17 in the morning, Allis-Chalmers tightened the last fitting, wiped his hands on a red shop rag he kept folded in his back pocket, looked at the engine for a moment and said to Dale and Wright, "Go ahead and try her." Dale climbed into the cab. The engine turned over. It caught on the second crank. Not a sputter, not a reluctant, half-hearted catch. It lit up clean and settled into that deep, steady diesel idle thump 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 that sounds like nothing so much as a large, healthy heart. The sound rolled out across that wheat field and kept going. You could hear it for a quarter mile. Dale and Wright sat in the cab for a moment without moving. Then he leaned out the window and looked down at Allis-Chalmers, who was already rolling up his tool set. "What was it?" "Vapor lock in the return line," Allis said. "She got too hot running in that afternoon heat the day before yesterday, built up a pocket. She'll need a heat shield on that line routing before next season, or she'll do it again." Dale stared at him. The engineer said, "They checked the pressure at the pump. That'll test fine with a vapor lock. You've got to check the line itself." He snapped the canvas closure on his tool roll. "She's fine now. Go cut your wheat." Gary Tischler had walked over. He was standing 6 feet away, listening. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Where'd you learn that?" Allis looked at him, watched a demonstration in Pratt in '67, didn't like the way they routed that return line, thought about it a while. "You thought about it since 1967. Off and on, he picked up his tool roll, his flashlight, and his glass jar. Bob Men said quietly to no one in particular, "We should have caught that." Nobody disagreed with him. Warren Pollock got out of his Buick when he heard the engine running. He walked over slowly, like a man trying to decide what expression to wear. He looked at the running combine. He looked at Allis-Chalmers. He opened his mouth once and closed it again. Allis-Chalmers walked back to his truck, put his tools behind the seat, and started to get in. Dale and Wright called after him, "What do I owe you?" Cleddy's paused with his hand on the door. He thought about it for a moment. "Cup of coffee sometime," he said, and he got in his truck and drove away down County Road 48, headed home because he had his own work to do. The Gleaner K idled in the field behind him, steady as a promise. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a field when a problem that has bested 4 men for 16 hours is solved in 47 minutes by a man nobody called. The wheat was standing and the machine was running, and nobody said anything for a long moment. Gary Tischler stood with his arms crossed, looking at the engine compartment that Cleddy's had left open. He reached in and traced the fuel return line with one finger, the routing, the placement, the way it ran close to the exhaust manifold in the afternoon sun. He stood like that for a while. Bobman got out his notebook. He wrote something down, then he wrote something else. Dale and Wright ran the combine for 11 hours that day, cut 186 acres of hard red winter wheat that had been waiting 2 days too long already. Ran it hard in the heat, and the machine never missed a beat. Warren Pollock drove back to Hutchinson in his clean Buick and did not stop for coffee. The story of what happened on Dale and Wright's field on June 22, 1971 did not make the Hutchinson news. It didn't make any paper. It spread the way stories spread in farming country, at the co-op, at the elevator, over fences, and at county road intersections when 2 trucks slow down beside each other and the windows come down. It moved through Reno County like water moves through good ground, quietly, thoroughly, finding every crack and corner. By the end of that harvest season, a lot of people in that county had heard some version of it. And they all knew who the old man in the green dickies was. Let me tell you what happened in the years that followed, because a story isn't just its moment. A story is everything that ripples out from that moment, year after year, until you can't find where the stone hit the water anymore. Gary Tischler drove back to Wichita on June 23, 1971, and the first thing he did when he got to his office was write a technical memo to the Allis-Chalmers engineering team in Independence, Missouri. The memo described the vapor lock condition in the K-series fuel return line, the circumstances under which it occurred, sustained operation above 88 degrees ambient, load factor above 75%, specific to the return line routing used in the 1968-1970 production run, and a recommended fix, which was a simple heat shield bracket and a rerouting of the return line approximately 4 inches further from the exhaust manifold. The fix cost Allis-Chalmers, by Gary Tischler's later estimate, about $3.40 per machine to implement as a running production change, and it was applied to every Gleaner K manufactured from the fall of 1971 onward. Gary Tischler's memo did not mention Cleddy's Harmon. It didn't need to, but Gary Tischler remembered. 6 years later, in 1977, Gary Tischler was in Nickerson, Kansas for a regional dealer meeting. On his own time, on a Saturday morning, he drove out to Cleddy's Harmon's place north of town. He knocked on the door. Ruth Elaine answered, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and called out to the machine shed. Cleddy's came out squinting in the morning light, still holding a half-inch wrench. Gary Tischler told him what he'd done with the memo, told him about the production change, told him that there were, by his rough estimate, somewhere between 800 and 1,200 Gleaner K combines in the field that had benefited from a fix that traced its origins to 47 minutes of work on a county road in Reno County, Kansas. Cleddy's listened to all of this, then he said, "You want some coffee?" Gary Tischler said yes. They sat at Ruth Elaine's kitchen table for 2 hours. Gary asked questions and Cleddy's answered them slowly and carefully about the Gleaner E, about the differences he'd noticed in the K-series, about 3 or 4 other things he'd observed over the years that he'd never had occasion to mention to anyone. Gary wrote most of it down. He told Cleddy's before he left that he wished there were 10 of him in every county in Kansas. Cleddy's laughed. It was a short laugh, quiet but genuine. He walked Gary Tischler back to his car, shook his hand, and watched him drive away down the county road. Then he went back to the machine shed, because there was still work to do. As for Dale and Wright, he became, in the years that followed, something he had not been before, a man who slowed down before he judged. The 2 cars and the 4 neckties had done something to him that June morning, had shown him a picture of himself that he didn't entirely like, He couldn't have put it in those exact words, but you could see it in how he talked to the older farmers at the co-op after that. He asked more questions. He listened more carefully. He and Cleddy's never became close friends. They were too different for that, different ages, different scales of operation, different temperaments. But they were the kind of neighbors who stopped for each other, who slows down on county roads, and that is, in farming country, its own kind of friendship. Warren Pollock sold farm equipment in Hutchinson for another 9 years. He sold plenty of it, but there are people in Reno County who will tell you, if you ask in the right way, that something went out of Warren Pollock after that June morning. Not his confidence exactly, more like his certainty. And certainty in a salesman is a particular kind of fuel. Without it, you still go, you just don't go quite as fast. Cleddy's Harmon farmed his 160 acres north of Nickerson until 1984, when his knees finally told him what his pride had been arguing against for 2 years. He sold the ground to a neighbor for $680 an acre. This was just before the farm crisis hit and land values dropped, which was either luck or wisdom. And with Cleddy's Harmon, you could never be sure which was which. He kept the machine shed. His Gleaner E, the 1961 model he'd bought second-hand in '63, he kept until the end. Never sold it. When people asked him why he kept an old combine he no longer needed, he'd look at them for a moment and then say something like, "She never left me in a field." Ruth Elaine passed away in 1989. Cleddy's lived in the house north of Nickerson until 1993, when he moved to a small place in town. He died in October of 1997 at the age of 89. In the same county where he'd been born, in the same county where he'd farmed for 36 years, in the same county where on a morning in late June 1971, he stopped his truck on a county road because a machine was sitting wrong at harvest time. His obituary in the Hutchinson News was 11 lines long. It listed his survivors, his church, and his years of farming. It did not mention the Gleaner K. Most of the things that matter most don't make it into obituaries. But people in Nickerson remembered. They remember still. Let me close with this. There is a kind of knowledge that doesn't come from classrooms, doesn't come from certifications or engineering degrees or 40 years of selling something. It comes from paying attention over time to things that most people don't think are worth paying attention to. Cleddy's Harmon looked at a fuel return line in 1967 and thought, that doesn't sit right. He didn't write it down, didn't tell anyone. Just kept it somewhere in the back of his mind, the way a good farmer keeps track of a wet corner of a field or a soft spot in a grain bin floor, not urgently, just steadily, because someday it might matter. 4 years later it mattered. There were 4 men with engineering degrees and collective decades of professional experience standing around that machine, and not one of them had thought to look at what an old farmer in green Dickies had been quietly thinking about since a Saturday demonstration in Pratt, Kansas. I want you to sit with that for a moment. We live in a time, maybe every time is this time, when credentials are treated as the whole of wisdom. When the person with the most letters after their name is assumed to know the most about a problem. And sometimes that's true, but wisdom isn't only housed in institutions. It isn't only found in manuals and engineering literature. Some of it, a very particular, very durable kind of it, lives in the hands and the eyes and the patient minds of men and women who have simply paid attention to one thing faithfully for a very long time. Cleddy's Harmon didn't fix that combination to prove a point. He didn't fix it to embarrass anyone. He stopped because the wheat was ready and a machine was broken and he thought he might know something useful. That's it. That's the whole reason. There was no score to settle, no reputation to establish, just a practical problem and a man who thought he could help. Let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you offered what you knew, quietly, without certainty of how it would be received, simply because you thought it might be useful? That, I think, is the real lesson of Cleddy's Harmon, not the vapor lock, not the fuel return line or the 47 minutes. The lesson is that he stopped his truck. He got out when he could have driven on. He walked into a situation where he wasn't wanted, where the official experts had the floor, where the easy thing, the dignified thing in some lights, was to keep going down County Road 48 and let other men handle other men's problems. He stopped, he looked, he offered what he had. The wheat got cut, the machine got fixed. 800 combines across the plains were quietly, invisibly improved because one man looked at a fuel line and thought about it for 4 years. Not all heroism is loud, not all expertise has a certificate, and not every story that changes things makes the newspaper. Some of them just drive away down a county road in a pickup truck, headed home because there's still work to do.